The night David died, the house went silent in a way that I don't think words will ever capture. I'm 47 years old, and I thought I had lived through grief before losing my parents, saying goodbye to dreams that never came true, but nothing prepared me for the sound of my husband's heart monitor flatlining. Nothing prepared me for the way my son's voice cut through the stillness, venomous and sharp, as he screamed into my face. Today he's gone, and tomorrow you're next. I remember clutching the edge of the hospital bed, my knuckles white, my body refusing to move. My son's words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, choking me, burning me. I wanted to believe I had misheard him, that grief had twisted his voice into something cruel. But then I saw his eyes, cold, hard, alive, with a fury that made my chest tighten. Those weren't the eyes of a grieving child. Those were the eyes of a predator. I suppose I should tell you who I am before I go further. My name is Elaine. I was born in a small town, raised by working-class parents who believed that love was shown through sacrifice. I carried those lessons into my marriage. I was 24 when I married David, and for a long time, I thought we had the kind of love people envy, messy, imperfect, but anchored in loyalty. We had one son, Marcus. I poured every ounce of myself into raising him, convinced that if I loved him enough, if I gave him the childhood I never had, he would grow into someone kind. But children don't always become the people we imagine. And sometimes, love isn't enough to save them. That night at the hospital, when Marcus spat those words at me, something inside me cracked. I had just lost my husband, and in the same breath, I realized I had lost my son too. The drive home was quiet, except for the pounding of my heart. Marcus didn't ride with me. He stormed off with some friends who had shown up at the hospital, men with hard faces and careless laughs. I sat in the car alone, the steering wheel slick beneath my trembling hands. The city lights blurred into streaks of white and gold, and all I could think was, how did we get here? David and I had noticed Marcus's darkness early on. He was 12 the first time I caught him stealing from my purse. 14 when he started disappearing at night, coming home smelling of smoke and alcohol. David always excused it, said he was just a boy testing his limits. But I saw the truth. I saw the way Marcus's eyes hardened whenever I told him no, the way his anger flared like dry tinder. Still, I convinced myself he would grow out of it. That if I kept loving him, he would eventually love me back. But standing in that empty kitchen the night David died, I knew I had been lying to myself for years. Marcus didn't see me as a mother. He saw me as an obstacle. The funeral was a blur of faces I barely recognized. Neighbors, distant cousins, co-workers of David's, all offering condolences, their voices soft and meaningless. I stood by the casket, my hand resting on the polished wood, and felt like I was floating above it all. Every hug, every whispered, "I'm so sorry for your loss," slid off me like water. The only thing that cut through the fog was Marcus standing in the back with his arms crossed, glaring at me as though I were the one buried in that casket. After the service, he cornered me near the church steps. His words were quiet enough that no one else could hear, but his tone carried the same venom as the night in the hospital. "Don't think for a second you're getting away with this. Dad's gone, and soon you'll be nothing too." I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand why he hated me so much. But my voice caught in my throat. The truth is, I didn't recognize him anymore. My son, the boy I once sang to sleep, the boy whose scraped knees I used to kiss, was gone. In his place stood a man who looked at me with eyes that promised destruction. That night, I found the letter. I had been going through David's things, trying to find insurance papers, when I stumbled on an envelope hidden in his desk. My name was written on it in his careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, my heart pounding with something between dread and hope. The letter was short, but every word carved into me like a blade. He wrote about debts, about money that had disappeared over the years. He confessed that Marcus had been in trouble gambling shady deals, things he hadn't wanted me to know. He admitted that he had covered for him again and again, until the weight of it began to crush him. And then, the line that haunts me still. If anything happens to me, forgive Marcus. He doesn't know the damage he's done. Forgive him. How could I forgive the son who looked me in the eye and told me I was next? How could I forgive the boy who had grown into a man who saw me not as a mother, but as prey? I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, tears blurring the words. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just grieving a husband. I was standing on the edge of a battlefield facing a war I never asked for. And Marcus, my own flesh and blood, was the enemy. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, the letter still clutched in my hand, like a fragile lifeline, my mind replaying every memory of Marcus's childhood. His first steps, the way he used to run into my arms after school, the nights he begged me to read just one more story before bed. Those memories should have comforted me, but instead, they twisted into something darker. Because behind every sweet moment, I began to see the shadows, the temper tantrums that lasted too long, the way he sometimes smiled when another child cried the lies that started small, but grew like weeds. By morning, the exhaustion sat heavy on my body, but my nerves buzzed like live wires. I went downstairs and found Marcus in the kitchen. He was drinking from a glass, leaning against the counter, as though he owned the house. He didn't look like a grieving son. He looked like a man waiting for someone to make the next move in a game only he understood. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Sleep well." I didn't answer. My voice felt buried under a mountain of fear and anger. He smirked, setting the glass down with a sharp clink. "You should be careful. Stress at your age can be dangerous." It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. He wanted me afraid. And the worst part was it was working. I called my sister later that day, desperate for some anchor, but she dismissed my worries. "Elaine, he's grieving. You know how young men are. They lash out. He'll come around." But I knew better. Marcus's cruelty wasn't grief, it was intent. Over the next weeks, I noticed things going missing. Jewelry cache, even one of David's watches that had been left for me. When I confronted Marcus, he only shrugged. "Maybe you misplaced them. You're not exactly young anymore, Mom." Memory fades. The way he said it made my blood run cold. I thought about going to the police, but what could I say? That my son threatened me with words no one else heard, that he was stealing from me, but leaving no proof. The world saw him as a grieving young man, and me as a fragile widow, unraveling under the weight of loss. No one would believe me. Then came the night I heard him on the phone. I had gone upstairs to grab a sweater, but as I passed his room, I caught his voice low and sharp. "She's still here. No, I'll handle it. Just give me more time." I froze in the hallway, every muscle rigid. He paused, as though sensing me, but when I leaned in closer, the room went quiet. By the time I dared to open the door, he was gone, just the hum of the empty line left behind. It was then I realized he wasn't just dangerous, he was planning something. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table staring at David's letter, the words echoing in my mind. Forgive Marcus, but forgiveness is not the same as survival. And I understood with a clarity that left me trembling that if I didn't act, I might not live long enough to forgive anyone. I started watching him more closely. I kept a journal writing down everything he did, every strange call, every item that went missing. I made copies of David's letter and hid them in places Marcus wouldn't think to look. It felt paranoid, maybe even desperate, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was reclaiming some small shred of power. But Marcus noticed. One night, as I closed the journal and slid it under a stack of old magazines, I felt his presence behind me. His voice was calm, too calm. "What are you hiding, Mom?" I turned slowly, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Just bills. Paperwork." He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're not as clever as you think." For a moment, I thought he might hit me. But instead, he laughed softly, a sound that chilled me more than any scream. "Careful, Mom. You don't want to end up like Dad." I didn't sleep that night either. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, wondering if Marcus had had something to do with David's death. The thought had never occurred to me before, but once it entered my mind, it rooted there like poison. Had David's heart really failed him, or had Marcus helped it along? The possibility gnawed at me, twisting my grief into suspicion. I wanted answers, but I was terrified of what I might find. Still, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. And then one rainy afternoon, as I sorted through David's belongings in the garage, I found the box. It was shoved behind old tools, taped shut, and heavy in my hands. My chest tightened as I pried it open. Inside were folders, bank statements, and photographs, evidence of debts, shady figures, and transactions that made my blood run cold. But it wasn't just Marcus's name I saw. David's handwriting was scrawled across many of the paper's notes about deals he had made, money he had borrowed. And then at the very bottom, I found something I wished I never had. A photograph of Marcus with men I didn't recognize. They stood outside a rundown bar, cash visible in their hands. But what froze me was Marcus's expression, confident, smug, like someone who had finally stepped into his true self. My hands trembled as I pressed the photo to my chest. David had tried to shield me from the truth. But the truth was here now, staring me in the face. My husband had been keeping secrets. My son was keeping darker ones. And I was caught in the middle of a storm that had been brewing for years. I sat on the cold garage floor for hours, staring at the evidence I had uncovered. My fingers numb from clutching that photograph of Marcus. Every instinct in me wanted to throw it all back in the box, seal it with tape, and pretend none of it existed. But there was no erasing what I had seen. David wasn't just the devoted husband and father I had clung to in my memories. He had been involved in something dangerous, something that now bled into our son's veins like poison. When I finally stood, my knees stiff and my body trembling, I knew this wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about survival. And if Marcus was the next chapter of David's hidden life, then I had to face the possibility that the boy I once cradled in my arms had turned into something monstrous, and that he might destroy me if I didn't find the courage to stop him. That night, I confronted Marcus. Not directly, not with the photograph, but with a careful question, one that burned in my throat. "Marcus," I said, as he sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone, "did your father ever involve you in his business?" He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker there. Fear, recognition, guilt, maybe all three. But then it was gone, replaced by that infuriating smirk. "Business," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Dad barely told you anything, and you think he was telling me, 'Don't be ridiculous.'" His voice was smooth, dismissive. But the way he avoided my gaze told me everything. I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door, my heart pounding. He knew. He had been part of it, maybe even more than David realized. And then the threats escalated. One morning, I found a dead bird on the porch, its neck broken clean. I wanted to believe it was just nature and accident, but the way it was laid out perfectly centered on the doormat told me otherwise. When I looked up, Marcus was watching from the window, his face blank, unreadable. Another night, I woke to the smell of gas. Panic ripped through me as I rushed to the kitchen. The stove burners were all on flames, flickering low beneath the metal grates. I hadn't cooked that evening. My hands shook as I twisted the knobs off, tears stinging my eyes. When I turned, Marcus stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed in the dim light. "Careful, Mom," he whispered, his voice low and venomous. "Accidents happen." I broke then. I sobbed, begged him to tell me why he was doing this, why he hated me. But he just walked past, brushing against my shoulder, as though I were nothing but air. I thought about running, but where would I go? This was my home, the one place I thought would be safe. And besides, some twisted part of me still wanted to save him, to believe there was a fragment of my son left beneath all that cruelty. But the box in the garage haunted me. So the next day, I called an old friend of David's, Michael, a man I vaguely remembered from barbecues and late-night poker games. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary when I introduced myself. "Elaine," he said slowly, "it's been a long time." I told him I'd found some of David's papers, that I was confused, that I needed to understand. There was a pause on the other end, and then he sighed heavily. "David tried to keep you out of it for a reason. You don't want to know." But I pressed, desperation cracking my voice. "Please, Michael, it's about Marcus. He's not the boy I knew. I think he's dangerous." Silence. And then, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, Michael said Marcus was in deeper than David. "Your husband owed people money, and when he couldn't pay, Marcus stepped in. He wasn't forced, Elaine. He wanted it. He thrived in it." The world tilted beneath me. My breath caught in my throat. Are you saying Marcus?" "I'm saying," Michael interrupted, "that your son isn't just following in David's footsteps. He's building his own empire. And if you stand in his way, he won't hesitate to cut you down." The line went dead before I could say another word. I dropped the phone, my body trembling so violently I thought I might collapse. My son wasn't just cruel. He wasn't just angry. He was dangerous, calculated, ambitious. And now I was the obstacle standing between him and whatever future he had carved out of darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized the truth: Marcus wasn't going to stop until I was gone. And the only question left was, would I survive him? The house no longer felt like mine. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow stretching across the walls at night made my skin crawl. I began moving quietly, cautiously, like prey, trying not to draw the attention of its predator. Except the predator was my own son, the boy I once sang lullabies to, the boy whose hair I smoothed back when he had fevers. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. But fear has a way of transforming into something else. When it lingers too long, it hardens into resolve. I knew then that waiting, hoping Marcus would come to his senses, was not only foolish, but suicidal. If I didn't fight back, I would end up another obituary in the paper, another tragic accident whispered about by neighbors. So I began preparing. I gathered everything from the garage box, spread it across my bedroom floor, and sorted through the filth of my husband's and son's hidden lives. Bank statements with withdrawals. I couldn't explain photographs of Marcus with men who looked like they belonged in mugshot scraps of paper with names and numbers scribbled in David's handwriting. Each piece was a puzzle, and though the picture was incomplete, I could see enough Marcus wasn't just dabbling in crime, he was entangled in something far larger, and I was caught in the snare. I took photos of everything, saved them to a USB drive, and slipped it into the lining of my purse. I didn't know who I would give it to or when, but I needed the security of knowing the truth wouldn't die with me. Marcus began noticing my distance. He circled me like a wolf testing my defenses. He'd stand in doorways watching without speaking. He'd smile too long, too wide, like he was savoring my fear. And then one night, he pushed further. I was in the kitchen pouring tea when he leaned in close and whispered, "Do you ever think about how Dad really died?" My hand froze on the kettle. Steam rose around us, hissing in the silence. "What do you mean?" My voice shook despite my effort to sound calm. Marcus tilted his head, eyes glinting. He wasn't strong anymore. He made mistakes. Sometimes he paused, his lips curling. Mistakes need to be corrected. The kettle slipped from my grasp, clattering to the counter. Hot water splashed across my hand, but I didn't feel the burn. All I could feel was the icy dread seeping into my bones. Had Marcus killed his own father? The thought devoured me. I searched for answers in every memory of David's last weeks, every word he spoke, every sigh of exhaustion. Had his heart truly failed him, or had my son ensured it would stop beating? The guilt clawed at me. What kind of mother had I been raising a child capable of such cruelty? What signs had I missed? How had I let the sweet boy with bright eyes and sticky hands at the breakfast table become this monster who smiled at my terror? I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep hoping. The truth was clear. Marcus wanted me gone. And unless I acted, it was only a matter of time before he made it happen. The breaking point came one stormy evening. The power had gone out, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a candle and sat at the table, the flame flickering weakly against the shadows. I heard footsteps behind me, deliberate, unhurried. Marcus's voice cut through the silence, low and venomous. "Do you know what tomorrow is, Mom?" I swallowed hard. What? The day Dad died. His hand landed on the back of my chair, gripping it tightly. Funny how things come full circle, isn't it? I turned slowly, the candlelight casting grotesque shadows across his face. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes burned with something wild, something unhinged. In that moment, I realized he had chosen tomorrow to be my last day. I barely slept that night. Instead, I packed a small bag, tucked the USB drive deep inside, and hid it in the trunk of my car. I told myself if I survived the morning, I would go to the police, to anyone who would listen. I didn't care if it meant exposing David's secrets. The truth had to come out. But survival wasn't guaranteed. At dawn, I stood by the window, watching the storm clouds roll away. My reflection in the glass startled me. I looked older, harder, my face lined with grief and resolve. I pressed my hand to the cold pane and whispered a silent prayer. If today is the day, let me be ready. Behind me, I heard Marcus's footsteps again. Slow, steady, approaching. And when he spoke, his words chilled me to the marrow. Today, you're the next. The words echoed in my skull like a death sentence. Today, you're the next. They weren't a threat anymore. They were a promise. I turned from the window and faced Marcus. He stood in the doorway of the living room, his arms folded casually across his chest, as though we were discussing something mundane, what to have for breakfast, what groceries to buy. But there was nothing casual about his eyes. They burned with intent, with the kind of cold certainty that left no space for doubt. For a moment, I thought of lunging past him, of running out the front door, barefoot, bag or no bag. But fear froze me in place. Or maybe it wasn't just fear, it was anger too. Anger at him, anger at David, anger at myself for allowing this to fester until it consumed us all. I forced my voice to remain steady. Why, Marcus? Why are you doing this to me? I gave you everything. I loved you with everything I had. His mouth curved into a chilling smile. Love, he scoffed, stepping closer. You call that love? You smothered me, controlled me, pretended like your perfect little world was all that mattered. Dad understood. He let me breathe. He let me be. And now he's gone, and you think you get to tell me what's right? What's wrong? His voice cracked into something sharp or raw. You don't get it, Mom. You never did. The world isn't about love. It's about power. And right now, you're standing in the way of mine. My knees shook, but I didn't let them buckle. Not in front of him. I took a deep breath and whispered, Did you kill your father? The silence that followed was unbearable. The candle on the table flickered, throwing shadows across his face. He tilted his head, slowly studying me, and then he laughed. Not a boy's laugh, not even a man's. It was hollow, jagged, like glass breaking. Let's just say he said finally Dad wasn't strong enough, and I don't make the same mistakes he did. The floor seemed to vanish beneath me. My worst fear had been confirmed not with a confession, but with something far worse, his pride. Before I could speak again, he lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. His grip was iron, his nails digging into my skin. You could make this easier, Mom, he hissed. You could just let go. But something inside me snapped then. Not fear, not grief, but a surge of defiance I hadn't felt in years. I yanked my wrist free with all the strength I had left and spat the words at him. If you want me gone, you'll have to fight for it, and you'll lose. The room crackled with tension. He stared at me, shocked for a heartbeat, and then his expression twisted into something darker. You think you can stop me? He sneered. You're nothing. Weak, old, alone. Maybe, I said, my voice low, but steady. But I'm still your mother, and you'll never be stronger than the truth. I didn't wait for his reaction. I ran. My bare feet slapped against the floor as I darted down the hallway, out the front door, and into the storm-soaked morning. The air was thick, heavy with rain, but I didn't care. I sprinted to the car, fumbling with the keys, praying I could make it before he caught up. Behind me, I heard the slam of the front door, his footsteps pounding closer. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as Marcus reached the driveway. His hand slapped against the car window, his face twisted with fury. You can't run from me, Mom! He shouted, his voice muffled by the glass. This isn't over! I floored the accelerator tires, screeching against the wet pavement. My heart hammered in my chest as I sped down the road, rain streaking across the windshield. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put distance between myself and the boy who was no longer my son. But as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, a crushing thought gripped me. Even if I escaped him today, Marcus wouldn't stop. He was too far gone, too entangled in the darkness that had swallowed David before him. And I couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I had to end this, not just for me, but for the memory of the family we once were, the family Marcus had destroyed. I drove until my hands cramped around the steering wheel, until the storm faded into a pale drizzle and the gray morning stretched into an unforgiving noon. Every mile that passed felt like both a relief and a tightening noose. I was free of Marcus's immediate reach, but his words echoed in my head. This isn't over. I pulled into a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where truckers nursed their coffee and waitresses called everyone Han. My reflection in the bathroom mirror startled me. My face was pale, streaked with rain, and tears my eyes wild. I hardly recognized myself. I washed my hands careful around the bruise already forming on my wrist where Marcus had grabbed me. The ache wasn't just physical, it was the weight of betrayal pressing deep into my bones. My son had become a monster, and part of me wondered if I was to blame for creating him. I ordered coffee I barely touched and pulled out the USB drive from my purse. It was so small, so fragile, yet inside it was proof of everything. The debts, the deals, the photographs that tied Marcus and David to something far darker than anyone knew. I turned it over in my hands, wondering who could be trusted with it. The police, the press, a lawyer. Whoever it was, it had to be someone stronger than me. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty: Marcus would come looking. He wouldn't stop until he got this drive, and if he couldn't find it, he'd come for me. I picked up my phone and dialed Michael David's old friend. My hands trembled as I waited for him to answer. When he finally did, his voice was rough, wary. "Elaine." I whispered, my voice breaking. "Marcus." He tried, he wanted to. I couldn't finish. The words stuck in my throat. Michael was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Where are you?" I gave him the name of the diner, hesitating, afraid of who else might be listening. "I'll come," he said. "Don't move. And Elaine, don't trust anyone else. Marcus has more friends than you realize." When he arrived, I almost collapsed with relief. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his face lined, but his presence steadied me. He slid into the booth across from me, his eyes scanning the room before settling on mine. "Show me what you found," he said quietly. I handed him the USB drive. He slipped it into his jacket without even glancing at it, like he already knew the weight it carried. "Elaine," he said, his voice low, "you need to understand something. Marcus isn't just dangerous because of who he is. He's dangerous because of who he knows. The men he's tied to, they don't care about family or blood or loyalty. They'll use him, and when he's no longer useful, they'll discard him. But until then, they'll protect him. Which means if you go to the police, it won't be enough. You need leverage. Real leverage." The words made my stomach twist. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I didn't want leverage. I just wanted my son back, the boy I'd lost somewhere along the way. But that boy was gone. All I had now was the man who had threatened to kill me. "What do I do?" I whispered. Michael leaned in closer. "You disappear. You let me handle this. I'll make sure this gets into the right hands. But you, if Marcus finds you again, it won't end with threats. You need to stay alive long enough for the truth to surface." Tears blurred my vision, but I nodded. It was the only plan that made sense. But fate has a cruel way of twisting even the best laid plans. As Michael walked me to my car, I caught sight of a figure across the parking lot. My heart stopped. Marcus. He was leaning against a dark sedan, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as if he'd been waiting for me. His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time I saw not just hatred, but triumph. Michael swore under his breath. "Get in the car, Elaine. Now." I froze my legs, refusing to move. Marcus pushed off the sedan and started walking toward us, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Mom," he called, his voice eerily calm across the rain-slick lot. "You didn't think you could hide from me, did you?" Michael stepped in front of me, his stance protective. "Stay back, Marcus," he warned. But Marcus only laughed. "This doesn't concern you, old man. This is between me and my mother." The tension crackled in the air, thick enough to choke on. I clutched the car door handle, my knuckles white, my heart hammering against my ribs. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There would be no running, no hiding. Marcus wouldn't stop. Not until one of us was gone. The rain had picked up again, a steady drumbeat on the asphalt that seemed to echo the pounding in my chest. Marcus kept advancing, each step deliberate, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles. Michael didn't move, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his coat, as if ready to reach for something hidden. "Mom?" Marcus said, his voice almost gentle now, and that made it worse. "You've made this harder than it had to be. Just hand it over. We can still fix this. We can still be family." His words were poison wrapped in silk, and for a flicker of a second, I wanted to believe him. To believe that under the rage and greed, my son was still there. But then, I remembered the bruises, the threats, the look in his eyes when he said I didn't deserve to live. "There's no fixing this," I said, my voice shaking but steady enough to cut through the rain. Marcus's smile faltered, replaced with something darker. "So that's your choice then." Michael shifted, blocking me from view. "Your mother doesn't owe you a damn thing, Marcus. You want what she has, you'll have to go through me first." Marcus tilted his head, studying Michael with a cold amusement. "Funny. I didn't realize babysitting was part of your retirement plan." Then he moved faster than I remembered him ever being. Michael grabbed him, the two of them colliding hard against the side of the car. The sound of metal denting under their weight made me flinch. "Run, Elaine!" Michael shouted, his voice raw with strain. But my legs refused to move. I stood frozen, watching my son and my husband's oldest friend grapple in the rain fists, flying rage spilling into every blow. Marcus broke free first. He shoved Michael back hard enough that he staggered, and then his eyes locked on me again. "I said this isn't over," he growled. And before I could even process what was happening, Marcus pulled something from his coat. The flash of steel under the dim parking lot light made my stomach drop. A knife. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. Michael lunged toward him again, but Marcus slashed outward the blade, catching Michael's arm. He stumbled, blood blooming against his sleeve. "Michael," I screamed. Marcus didn't look at him. His focus was all on me, eyes blazing, steps quickening as he closed the distance between us. And in that instant, with the storm raging around us, I understood this was no longer about evidence or debts or leverage. This was survival. Would you like me to continue right into the confrontation, what happens when Marcus reaches Elaine, or build more tension first, showing her inner conflict before the moment explodes? Marcus's face was twisted with something unrecognizable, half fury, half desperation. The knife glistened as he raised it, rainwater dripping from the blade. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the storm, drowning out reason. "Mom," he spat, "you've taken everything from me? Everything that should have been mine. If I can't have it, then no one will." Michael staggered forward, clutching his bleeding arm, but his voice was strong. "Marcus, stop! This isn't you!" "Oh, shut up!" Marcus roared, swinging the knife toward him in a blind arc. Michael barely dodged his feet, slipping against the slick pavement. And in that breathless second, my body moved before my mind caught up. I lunged toward Marcus, not with strength, but with something deeper, something primal. I thought of the child I had nursed, the little boy whose fever I once prayed over the sun, who used to curl against me after nightmares. That boy was gone, but my love for him wasn't, and it was that same love that gave me the courage to act. I grabbed his wrist, both hands clamping down on the arm holding the knife. The force of it jolted through me. His strength was terrifying. He snarled in my face, the smell of rain and sweat and rage mixing in the air. "Let go," he hissed, but I didn't. I held on with everything I had left, even as the blade pressed closer to my skin. Michael came from behind, wrapping his good arm around Marcus's chest, trying to drag him back. The three of us struggled, tangled together in the downpour, a grotesque dance between love, betrayal, and survival. "Marcus!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Stop this! Please look at me. I'm your mother." For a moment, just a moment, his eyes flickered. A boy lost inside the man, a memory of something softer, weaker. My heart clenched, but then it was gone, swallowed by the void in him. "You're nothing to me," he whispered. And then he shoved me hard. My body hit the wet ground, pain shooting up my side. The knife flashed again, this time driving toward Michael's chest. But Michael was ready. He twisted, redirecting the blow, and the two men toppled against the hood of the car. The knife clattered against metal, slipped, and skidded to the ground. I scrambled up my knees, shaking, and saw it lying there. Cold, deadly, within reach. I didn't think. My hand closed around it, the weight of it heavy and unfamiliar. My son and Michael were still locked in brutal struggle, Marcus's fists flying. Michael straining to hold him back. And then Marcus broke free again, his chest heaving, his eyes black with rage. He turned toward me, stepping closer, his mouth curled into a promise of violence. And I raised the knife. "Don't come any closer," I whispered, though my voice was swallowed by the storm. Marcus stopped. For the first time that night, he looked almost startled. Then he laughed, low, cruel, mocking. "You," he said, "you couldn't." But my hands didn't lower. I stood there trembling, but unyielding, the weight of every memory pressing into me. The betrayals, the lies, the nights I cried alone, the threats that had turned my own son into my executioner. I felt Michael's eyes on me. I felt the world holding its breath, and in that frozen heartbeat, I knew one of us would not leave this place alive. The rain felt like needles against my skin, sharp and relentless, as if the sky itself demanded a verdict. Marcus took a step closer, daring me, taunting me with the smirk on his face. He thought I wouldn't do it. He thought the woman who had once kissed his scraped knees and tucked him into bed could never raise a hand against him. And maybe he was right. Maybe a part of me was still that mother, still clinging to the impossible dream that my son was buried somewhere beneath the cruelty, that if I just said the right words, he would drop the rage and remember who I was. But then I saw Michael bleeding and broken, struggling to stay upright. I saw the years of my life that Marcus had tried to burn to ash, the lies, the manipulation, the greed. I felt the bruise still throbbing on my arm from the night he told me I didn't deserve to live. And I knew. My hands stopped trembling. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice cracking open like glass. "And all you ever did was take." Marcus tilted his head, still smiling, but I caught it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to stand. I raised the knife higher. "Not anymore." He lunged. Time slowed, fractured into jagged pieces. His face loomed closer, twisted with rage, his arms outstretched. I felt my own arm move, felt the sharp weight in my hand cut through the space between us. A sound tore through the rain, a guttural cry, raw and shocking. For a moment, I didn't know whose it was. Then I saw Marcus stagger back, his eyes wide, his mouth opening like he wanted to speak, but no words came out. He looked down at the knife, buried deep in his side, my hand still on the hilt. Blood bloomed across his shirt, dark and spreading fast. The smirk was gone. The certainty was gone. For the first time in years, he looked small again, like the boy I once held, not the man who had tried to destroy me. He stumbled, his knees buckling. Michael caught him, instinctively lowering him to the ground, even as his own blood dripped steadily from his arm. I dropped the knife. It clattered against the pavement, an ugly final sound. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body shaking so violently I thought I might shatter. Marcus looked up at me, his lips trembling. Rain washed over his face, mixing with the blood. "Mom," he whispered. Just that. One word. Weak. Fragile. Almost human. Tears blurred my vision. I wanted to reach for him, to cradle his head, to tell him I loved him even now, even after everything. But my feet wouldn't move. My hands wouldn't obey. I stood frozen, the weight of what I'd done pressing down until I could barely breathe. Michael's voice broke through the storm, urgent and steady. "Elaine, we have to call an ambulance. Now." But all I could hear was that single word echoing in my skull. "Mom." The last word my son might ever say. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with rain and shaking so hard I could barely grip it. My fingers felt like they didn't belong to me, numb and clumsy, but somehow I managed to dial. My voice cracked when the operator answered. I could hardly string words together, stabbing, "parking lot," bleeding out. Michael pressed his good hand against Marcus's wound, his face taut with urgency. Blood pooled beneath them, seeping into the cracks of the pavement, mixing with the storm water and swirling away in crimson rivers. "Stay with us," Marcus Michael said through clenched teeth. "Don't you dare close your eyes." I sank to my knees, my body collapsing beside them. My son's gaze flicked to mine. It wasn't filled with rage anymore. It wasn't mocking. It was something else entirely, confusion maybe. Regret. A flicker of the boy he once was. "I didn't," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the rain. "I didn't mean, Mom?" My throat burned, my chest aching with words I couldn't form. I wanted to scream at him for everything he had done, every scar he had carved into me. But I also wanted to hold him, to tell him I'd never stopped loving him, no matter how far he had fallen. So I said the only thing I could. "I'm here, Marcus. I'm here." The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, cutting through the storm. Blue and red lights soon flashed against the walls, painting the parking lot in harsh, surreal colors. Paramedics rushed in, their voices brisk and commanding, their hands moving with practiced urgency. They pushed me back gently but firmly, taking over where Michael had been pressing down. I felt like I was floating outside of my own body, watching strangers kneel over my son, attaching tubes, shouting measurements, trying to wrestle him back from the edge. Michael tugged me a few steps away, his hand steady on my shoulder. His face was pale blood soaking through his sleeve, but his voice was calm. "You did what you had to do, Elaine. If you hadn't," he shook his head, "he would have killed you." As they lifted Marcus onto a stretcher, I caught his eyes one last time. They were half-lidded, unfocused, but still searching for me. His lips moved, forming a shape I couldn't hear. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was love. I'll never know. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with them went the last fragile threads of control I had been clinging to. I stood in the rain, my body numb, watching the flashing lights disappear into the night. Michael squeezed my shoulder, grounding me, but nothing could erase the echo of that single word still lodged in my chest. Mom. The house was unbearably quiet when I returned that night. Michael insisted on driving me home after he had his arm stitched up, though I barely remember the ride. My clothes were still damp, my hair plastered to my face, the faint metallic tang of Marcus's blood clinging to my skin, no matter how many times I scrubbed my hands in the sink. The silence pressed against me like a living thing. This was the same house where Marcus had grown up, the kitchen, where he used to sneak cookies, the hallway, where his laughter once bounced after games of hide-and-seek, the bedroom, where I had read him bedtime stories until he drifted off to sleep. Every corner held echoes of a boy who no longer existed, a boy I had buried long before tonight. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the phone on my nightstand. The hospital had promised to call with updates. I both dreaded and needed that ring, knowing it would tether me to a reality I wasn't ready to face. Michael hovered in the doorway. His arm bandaged his face, etched with exhaustion. "You should try to rest," he said softly. I shook my head. "How can I rest? He might be—" My voice broke before I could finish the sentence. Michael stepped inside, lowering himself into the chair across from me. "Elaine, you saved your life tonight. And mine. Don't lose sight of that." I wanted to scream at him that saving my life didn't matter if it meant destroying my son's. But the scream died inside me, curling into a knot of silent grief. The phone rang at 3:12 a.m. I jolted upright, fumbling to answer. "Mrs. Keller." The nurse's voice was professional but not unkind. "Your son is stable for now. He lost a significant amount of blood, but the surgeons were able to stop the internal bleeding. He's in recovery. We'll keep him under observation for the next 48 hours. Relief and devastation crashed over me at once. Stable. Alive. Yet the word felt hollow, like a reprieve rather than salvation. After the call ended, I sat there clutching the phone to my chest, shaking with sobs that refused to quiet. Michael moved to my side, pulling me into his good arm. For the first time that night, I let myself collapse, the dam inside me finally breaking. "He called me Mom," I whispered into his shirt, like he was still my little boy. Michael rested his chin against my hair. Maybe that was the real Marcus, the part of him you thought was gone. Maybe in the end, he remembered. I wanted to believe him. I wanted so desperately to believe that single word meant something, that beneath all the cruelty and betrayal, my son's heart had not been entirely lost. But the storm wasn't over. Marcus was alive, yes, but the rage, the debts, the secrets, they still lingered like shadows waiting to pounce. And I knew deep down that survival tonight didn't mean peace tomorrow. It only meant the battle had changed. The days that followed blurred into a haze of sterile hospital corridors and sleepless nights. I sat at Marcus's bedside, listening to the steady beep of machines, watching the rise and fall of his chest under crisp white sheets. Tubes and monitors surrounded him, making him look smaller, weaker, almost childlike again. I should have felt relief, but all I could feel was an ache that split me down the middle. Every so often, his eyes would flicker open, hazy and confused. Sometimes he would stare at me blankly, as if I were just another shadow in the room. Other times, his gaze carried a weight I couldn't decipher, accusation or maybe sorrow. We rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was brittle, fragmented. "You stabbed me!" he whispered once, his eyes glassy, unfocused. I choked back tears. "You were going to kill me, Marcus. You left me no choice." His lips curled, but not into a smile. "Still, you did it. You actually did it." His voice trailed off, leaving only the hum of machines between us. The words cut deeper than the knife ever had. Because he was right. No matter the reasons, no matter the desperation, I had been the one to put that blade into him. The knowledge sat like poison in my veins. Michael visited often, his arm healing slowly. He tried to reassure me, tried to remind me that I had done what was necessary. But even he couldn't deny the shift in Marcus's demeanor. The boy we once knew was fractured, jagged, unpredictable. On the third night, I overheard the nurses whispering at the desk. "That's the one of them said quietly. The son who turned on his own mother." Can you imagine? I walked away before I heard the rest, but their words clung to me. Everyone knew now. Our story had slipped beyond the confines of our broken family. And once whispered into the world, some wounds never heal. Marcus's debts still loomed like vultures circling overhead. The men who had cornered him before would not vanish simply because he was lying in a hospital bed. And I knew that when he left this place, if he left, he would have choices to make. Choices that could destroy us both again. One evening, as I sat by his bed, he turned his head toward me. His eyes were sharper this time, clearer. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his voice barely a rasp. The question pierced me in a way nothing else had. My throat closed, my chest constricted. Hate him. My son. My own blood, I wanted to scream. Yes. I wanted to say that he had ruined me, that he had dragged my heart through fire and ash until there was almost nothing left. But when I opened my mouth, the truth that came out was softer, more devastating. "I hate what you've done, Marcus, but I could never hate you." He stared at me, searching my face for something. Forgiveness, maybe, or weakness. I wasn't sure. He closed his eyes again, retreating back into the fog. And I sat there in the dim hospital light, realizing that survival was not victory, that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with knives or fists, but with love stretched so thin it feels like it might snap. The weeks turned into months, and though Marcus's body healed, the fracture between us remained like a canyon too wide to cross. When the hospital finally released him, Michael and I brought him back to the house, but it didn't feel like a homecoming. It felt like placing a stranger into the ruins of a life that used to be whole. Marcus walked the halls like a ghost, silent most days, brooding others. Sometimes he lashed out, slamming doors, snapping words like knives. Other times, I'd catch him staring out the window for hours as if waiting for someone to appear. I knew who. Those men, the ones he owed. The debts hadn't vanished. They never do. At night, I lay awake, listening for footsteps, for the creak of the stairs that might mean he was leaving, or worse, coming for me again. I hated myself for thinking that way. But once you've looked into your child's eyes and seen death aimed at you, trust is no longer possible. Love may survive, but trust dies. One evening, I found Michael on the porch, cigarette smoke curling around him like a shroud. He had quit years ago, but stress had dragged him back to old habits. "He's not done," Michael said without turning to me. "You can see it in his eyes. He's biding his time." I hugged myself against the chill. "He's still my son." Michael finally faced me, his expression carved in stone. "And one day, he'll kill you if you let him stay." The words sliced through me, cruel but not untrue. Days later, the phone rang. I answered, expecting some harmless telemarketer, but the voice on the other end froze the blood in my veins. "Mrs. Keller," a man said smoothly, too calm, too deliberate. "Tell your boy we're running out of patience. Debt doesn't disappear just because he hides behind his mother." The line went dead before I could speak. When I turned, Marcus was standing in the doorway, his face pale, but his eyes blazing with fury. He had heard every word. "You shouldn't have answered," he hissed. "You've just made it worse." I wanted to shake him, to scream at him for dragging us into his pit of darkness. But all that came out was a whisper. "Then tell me how to fix it, Marcus. Tell me what I can do." He didn't answer. He just stormed upstairs, the slam of his door rattling the frame. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, knowing the truth I had tried so hard to bury. One way or another, this story would end in blood, either his or mine. The only question left was whose fate would claim us first. The phone call felt like a guillotine, swift, precise, and impossibly final. I listened to the recorded voice on the line, replaying in my head long after the connection dropped. Debt doesn't disappear because he hides behind his mother. The words looped like a threat with teeth. I had thought the worst had happened that night in the parking lot, that I had already touched the low point of our story. But there was always another drop, another hollow ache waiting to be discovered beneath the last. Marcus's silence after the call wasn't the silence of a man startled. It was the silence of someone who had expected it, counted on it, and now had to figure out how to use it to his advantage. I began to see our life as a ledger, every moment itemized with a balance due. My husband's kindnesses had entries that read like liabilities. His attempts to shield us from consequences had interest accruing in shadowy accounts that neither of us had fully understood. I flipped through the files I'd saved again and again like a talisman, as if repetition could turn these jagged truths soft. The photograph with Marcus and the men in front of the shabby bar haunted me. The bank statements with irregular withdrawals stared back like accusation. But there was one folder I hadn't been able to open. An envelope tucked behind the other's edges yellowed, the flap sealed with wax. I'd put it away because I was afraid of what it might say. Fear is a quiet thief. It convinces you the past will stay hidden if you never give it a reason to show itself. That day, fear felt more dangerous than the truth. When I finally broke the seal, the paper inside smelled faintly of smoke and old whiskey. A typed report, pages stapled together, listed names, dates, and a thing that made my stomach drop so hard I had to sit down, a paternity test request filed 10 years earlier by a man whose name was not David's. The lab result attached beneath it showed a probability so clear and cold it left no room for misinterpretation. Marcus was not David's son. The world shifted under my feet. I read the lines over and over until the letters blurred. Images from Marcus's childhood crowded my vision, how David would roughhouse with him, how they had the same stubborn chin, how David had always been so patient in ways I had misunderstood as tolerance. If Marcus wasn't David's, then everything we had relied on, history, loyalty, the narrative of who we were, was unstable. A million small questions multiplied into a storm. Who had known? Why had David kept it a secret? Had he been trying to protect me from a truth that would have changed Marcus's trajectory? Or had someone else used that absence of truth to warp my son's sense of belonging into entitlement and rage? I discovered another document below the paternity report, a letter from David to me in handwriting that trembled. He wrote about shame and a promise he had kept to the end. He wrote that when Marcus was born, he'd felt unmoored the anchor that kept our marriage steady because the child inside my arms wasn't his by blood. He claimed he didn't care, he loved the boy anyway. He had fought to be father and had been fiercely for years. Then the line stalled. There was a jagged tear and an abrupt ending. I folded the letter back into itself like it might fit there if I pressed hard enough. I wanted to believe it meant he had chosen us, that he had been looking out for us, but the next page undid that tenderness. Tucked beneath the letter was a single sentence in capitals: "If anything happens to me, forgive him. He doesn't know who he is. Forgive him." The same plea David had written before. I began to understand the terrible double life he'd been carrying, protector, liar, and moneymaker, in corners where the light seldom touched. Perhaps he thought a secret parentage would be kinder than the reality of Marcus's choices. Perhaps he had been keeping Marcus afloat, paying debts, making transfers because he loved the boy who wasn't his by blood, or because he felt guilt for forging a family identity out of uncertain pieces. If that was true, it was the purest kind of tragedy, a man bankrupting himself to give a son a place to stand, while that son stacked the platform with tinder and lit a match. Knowing that Marcus carried the knowledge of his own paternity, did he know changed everything? If he had known if someone had told him the truth and weaponized it, then his rage made a bitter kind of sense. Entitlement isn't born in a vacuum. Sometimes it is cultivated by absence, by a hollow left where identity should be. If you'd been told the man you grew up with was a stranger, if you'd felt like an imposter in a life anyone could revoke, you might lash out to secure what you believed you deserved. That in itself is no excuse for violence. It is explanation which is different from absolution. I confronted Michael with the papers that night, watching his face under the yellow lamp. He sighed the way men do when they carry the knowledge of what they cannot change. He told me finally that David had been trying to protect me from scandal because the moment Marcus knew he was not David's son, Marcus could have been crueler, more erratic. Your husband thought you needed stability more than drama, Michael said. He made choices, bad ones, some are unforgivable, to keep the family together. The words left me with the weird taste of salt and iron. I thought of David's last months, his phone calls, his worried eyes, and I imagined him balancing two terrible truths, the man he loved and the son he'd claimed. The revelation added a new thread to the tapestry of betrayal. Marcus's hatred toward me had always felt like a blunt instrument, pure and personal, but now I saw a complexity that made me ache. If he had been told, perhaps subtly, or if he'd uncovered things and had felt cheated by the myth of our family, maybe his fury had roots inside the story I'd told him by being the mother who loved without question. Or maybe he had never known, and in his hungry ambition had found a way to pin blame on me for the life he wanted, but had not been given in the terms he preferred. What terrified me was how the discovery didn't make the danger any less. If anything, it sharpened the stakes. Marcus was not simply a son steeped in violent entitlement. He was a man who had suffered identity wounds and then turned them outward using cruelty as armor. The papers were not just evidence of crimes. They were mirror shards that reflected how fragile the architecture of our family had been. Each shard cut deeper. I thought about the night he'd screamed at the hospital and realized the words had been more than rage. They'd been a prophecy spoken by someone who felt their world could be taken away. Today, you're the next. Maybe in his mind, I had been the one to owe him truth, identity, and validation. Maybe his fury had its own narrative of injury. None of that made his violence acceptable. None of it made the nights I'd spent pretending everything was fine any less culpable. But it did reframe the battlefield. I was not merely a target of greed. I was a guardian of a story I'd helped write, one with lies threaded into love. With this new understanding came a dangerous clarity. I could use the files, the paternity report, the evidence of debts and manipulations as leverage, legal and social arsenals that could peel away his power if I assembled them carefully. Or I could let the truth fester in private, believing that exposure would only make him more dangerous. The question became not whether to act, but how. Acting could pierce the last fragile ties and scatter our names into a public ledger of shame. Not acting could mean waiting for a final, irreversible end. That night, I put the papers back in the envelope and slid the USB into my coat pocket. I looked at the house I had built and the son I had created, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no illusions about silver linings. The past had peeled open like a wound. What remained was the raw imprint of survival. I had a choice to expose the truth and risk destroying the last vestiges of family, or to keep the secret and let the rot continue. I fell asleep with those options weighing like stones in my chest. In the small hours, I dreamed of David's face, how he had once looked at us both with fierce, flawed devotion, and of Marcus's tiny hand in mine, and of the knife that had come between us. When morning bled into the world, the choice felt less like strategy and more like a moral reckoning. I could hide the truth to spare myself the pain of public disgrace, but hiding felt like complicity. If I wanted a future that honored the parts of my life that were still worth saving, I would have to face the damage with courage and with the intention of ending the cycle he had been trapped in by force, if necessary, by law if possible, and by exposing the lies that had grown into a monster. I called the lawyer I'd been avoiding and asked for a meeting. My voice was steadier than I felt. When I hung up the phone somewhere behind my ribs, a flame of resolve lit. I was no longer merely surviving. If the truth had a price, I was prepared to pay it. I would tell the story that had been hidden in the dark, even if it meant tearing the house down around me. Because lying to save a life that would turn on you was not a mercy, it was a sentence. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old paper, the kind of place where secrets were transcribed into sterile language. I sat across from him, the envelope heavy on the desk between us. His hands were deliberate as he unfolded the documents, bank statements, photographs, the paternity test. He didn't flinch at the debts or the names, but when he reached the lab report, his brow furrowed. He set it down carefully, as if the paper itself carried weight beyond its ink. "You understand," he said, voice calm, but clipped, "that this is not just evidence of fraud or debt. This is a foundation shift. If this comes out in court, it changes inheritance rights, custody arguments, even criminal proceedings. It could dismantle everything Marcus thinks he's standing on. And it could destroy what's left of your family's reputation." His words were clinical, but their implications rattled through me. He was telling me that the truth was a weapon, but also a grenade. If I pulled the pin, no one walked away clean. "What are my options?" I asked. He tapped the papers. "Option 1, we use this to negotiate quietly. Leverage. Marcus will understand that if he pushes you, if he continues this path, his entire claim to anything collapses. He'll have no legitimacy to stand on, no sympathy in court, no inheritance rights. He'll be forced to settle. And the other option, option 2, you go public. File charges, civil suits, restraining orders. Expose the debts, the threats, the identity issues. You'd likely win protection, but you'd also paint a target on yourself. He will fight you harder. Men like him, men with that much to lose, they don't surrender gracefully." I sat in silence, staring at the faint shadow of David's handwriting visible through the folded letter. Forgive him. He doesn't know who he is. The irony twisted in my chest. To forgive was one thing. To survive was another. The lawyer slid the envelope back toward me, his eyes steady. "You have to decide what matters more, preserving the illusion of family or preserving yourself. You can't have both anymore." That night, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to the cemetery. David's grave was damp with fresh rain, the stone darkened and glistening under the streetlight. I knelt in the mud and placed the envelope against the cold granite. My voice broke as I whispered, "You carried this secret to protect us, but it's killing me now. What do I do? David, what do I choose?" The wind moved through the trees like an answer I couldn't understand. Behind me, I heard a sound, a crunch of gravel, deliberate and slow. My breath caught in my throat. When I turned, a shadow was standing just beyond the light. Too still, too familiar. "Mom," Marcus's voice came low and unreadable. "What are you doing out here?" The envelope was still in my hand. He stepped closer, his eyes catching the glow. There was no rage in his face this time, only suspicion and something sharper. "What's that?" My pulse hammered so loud it drowned the silence between us. I had two choices: tell him now in the dark with David watching, or lie again and risk the truth detonating later. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which choice would kill me faster. The moment at the cemetery passed like a storm cloud rolling overhead, threatening, but not breaking. I told Marcus nothing that night. I clutched the envelope to my chest and told him it was just old papers of his father's things I wasn't ready to let go of. He didn't believe me, not really, but he didn't push. Not then, but silence has its own cost. Within weeks, Marcus was back in trouble. The threats grew sharper, the calls more frequent. Men lurked near the house watching, and I knew that sooner or later, my silence would turn deadly. So I made my choice. I handed the documents to the lawyer, and by the following month, the courts had them too. The truth detonated like a bomb. Marcus was not David's son. He had no claim to the estate, no shield against the men he owed, no ground left to stand on. The scandal ripped through the community, whispers spreading like wildfire. My family's name was dragged through the mud, but for once, I could breathe. Marcus's reaction was the hardest. He stormed into the courtroom during a hearing, his eyes red, his face contorted. "You ruined me," he screamed across the chamber, his voice cracking. "You're not my mother. You're my executioner." The bailiffs dragged him out as he kicked and spat, but his words burrowed into me like barbs. I wasn't his executioner. I was his mother. But being his mother had nearly cost me my life, and I refused to sacrifice what was left of me on the altar of his destruction. Not long after Marcus disappeared. Some said he fled town to escape the debts. Others whispered darker endings. I stopped asking. There comes a point when not knowing is the only way to survive. Michael and I rebuilt our lives slowly, piece by piece. We moved into a smaller home, far from the shadow of the old one. The quiet was different now, not suffocating, but peaceful. At night, I still heard Marcus's voice sometimes, that last scream echoing in my dreams. But I also remembered his whisper in the rain-soaked yard, the single word Mom spoken like a lifeline. Maybe both were true. Maybe my son was both the child who once clung to my hand and the man who wanted me dead. Maybe love and betrayal can exist inside the same body, tearing it apart until nothing is left. What I know is this secret's rot families from the inside out. What David thought he was protecting us from was the very thing that destroyed us. If I could speak to anyone listening, I'd say this: don't bury your truths. Don't let silence raise children who choke on lies. The truth may break you, but it's the only thing that can set you free. So here I am, scarred, but still standing. My husband is gone, my son is lost, but I am alive. And survival, I've learned, is its own kind of revenge. If this story touched you, please like this video, share it so others can hear it, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like mine. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in my place?